Welcome, Professor Gilliland and Professor Marciano. Please begin your speech. 我们掌声欢迎。
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, I think so. Thank you. And thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today. I think Professor Marciano and we're sad that we can't be with you today. And I know we have many colleagues, many friends there in the audience. Today, we want to talk about the issue of how we actually educate. How do we prepare archivists to work in this digital environment and bring new technologies to the work that they do? So I am going to present the first half of this presentation, and then I'm going to turn it over to Professor Marciano to take over from me. So what we're going to do today, first of all, very quickly, we're going to give you a definition for computational archival science, the sort of meta field that particularly Professor Marciano, but he and I and many others have been working in for quite some time now. And secondly, I'm going to talk about how computational processes touch upon archival work. I'm then going to introduce a project that is led by Professor Marciano, and I am the person who's co-leading that project with him, a project called Talent. And then I'm going to focus very briefly on the part of the project for which I'm responsible, which is thinking about how issues of societal concern, issues such as algorithmic bias, but also ethical concerns feature in computational approaches in archives. And then I'm going to stop talking, and Professor Marciano is going to take over from me, and he is going to talk about some of the case studies that he and others who he has been collaborating with have developed for use in teaching computational approaches in archives. So first of all, to do just a little bit of definition, as I mentioned, Professor Marciano and colleagues have been working in this area for quite some time, and they've published a working definition for computational archival science back in 2018. And that definition is that this is a transdisciplinary field. It crosses disciplines, it crosses professions, that is concerned with the application of computational methods and resources to large-scale records and archives processing, analysis, storage, long-term preservation, and access, with the goals of improving efficiency and productivity and precision in appraisal, arrangement and description, preservation and access decisions. And I think as I speak to you in this presentation, I'm going to push that definition a little further, because now we're in 2023, and try to leave you with the thought that computational methods, which are pretty much essential when we're working at a very large scale, are actually methods that we should be thinking about applying in all of our work, regardless of the scale, and moving from a predominantly manual paradigm into a predominantly digital paradigm. And I'm also going to push the sort of spaces in which I think archivists also need to be engaged. So in order to do this, I want to make this a little less abstract, this discussion. And this is really because it has been quite difficult either to develop the teachers of archivists, the professors who teach them, to develop those skills, or even the awareness of where computational processes would be appropriate to use in archival work, and archival work as opposed to digital humanities work or STEM data work, but specifically in archival work. And it's, I think, been equally difficult. Perhaps this is just an American experience to persuade students that this is also not just an important part of archival work, but an essential part of archival work. And so I'm going to use here a model I think that is probably familiar to many of you who are listening. It is the Open Archival Information System reference model, or it's known as the OAIS reference model. It's an ISO standard 14721. And this is a model that wasn't developed by archivists. It was modeled by space data scientists who had a need to manage vast quantities of data. And they laid out what they saw to be the archival processes that were necessarily involved. And so I'm going to look at each of the sort of areas of processes and explain really why archivists need to be engaged in each of those areas and what kinds of things they might be doing, and why one would want to be using computational methods in order to do that. So I'm going to start, first of all, on the left-hand side of this model, which is, in the model's terms, the producer side, but we might in archives call it the creator side as well. There is already really extensive computer processing happening on the side, on the creator side, both in research functions and in bureaucratic functions, and indeed in personal functions as well. Computational processing is being used to create and to gather and to compile, as well as to analyze data. Sometimes that data is embedded in records, but it's also essential that when you are working with data, that you're also generating records that document that activity. We need those records for evidentiary accountability and transparency purposes. And then computational processing is also being used to manage active data and active records. So in line with the way that appraisal is done in the records continuum, archivists and records managers really need to get engaged this early in the process of creating data and designing systems. Many don't have those responsibilities. I would argue that they should have. Archivists and records managers may or need to be responsible for ensuring that accountable and transparent records are indeed created, that they are archivable. That means you've got to be able to separate them out and transfer them into archival stewardship, or disposable, that they need to be able to be eliminated. And at the same time, the algorithms that are used in computational processes also need to be able to be accountable, to be transparent, to be accurate, to be ethical. We really need records that track the algorithms. And this involves not only understanding computational processing that is happening, but will probably involve employing additional computational processing. On the other side of the model, probably the one that many of you are most familiar with, the consumer side, which we might call the user side or the researcher side in archives, there is also a lot of computational processing already happening in the digital humanities, in the STEM fields in particular, also in the social sciences, where scholars are using content that has been created to collate, they're seeking to cross-compile, seeking to analyze both digitized and born digital archival materials in new ways, to use the technology to look at this material in new ways in order to gain new insights. And what is really important and still needs a lot more work is that archivists, when they process that archival content, have to be able to prepare it in ways that end users, consumers, can actually do the kinds of computational processing that they want to do. So this is also anticipating somebody else's needs with computational processing. So they have to ensure that archival content can be compiled, it can be manipulated, it can be curated at whatever the appropriately granular level is, and it should have sufficient and often added descriptive metadata that will support new kinds of disciplinary research questions. So now we've looked at both sides of the box, I want to go inside the box, into the archival box here in the model, and sort of work my way through the processes. So the first place I want to start on the left-hand side here is what happens during something that is not actually mentioned in the model, archival appraisal, the process of deciding what's actually even going to come to the archives, and the process of ingest. So given the huge volume and complexity and contingency of many kinds of born digital records today, it is increasingly impossible for humans to appraise the materials, and it's also impossible for them to ingest them doing it manually. They're going to have to be able to do it using computational tools to help them do it, to identify the materials, to make decisions about what needs to be separated out and brought to the archives, or what needs to be disposed of, to ingest it, and in the process of doing that, to secure relationships between records, the documentary context of the records coming in, establishing them within their archival bond inside the archive, and also securing the relationships between the records and the records components held inside those records. During archival preservation, which is sort of the top of that box, we already know that manual digital preservation processes for digital archival content, they simply don't scale when you start to move to large-scale amounts of material. Archivists are going to have to employ computational approaches for a lot of the routine activities involved in digital preservation, which include things like integrity checking, regular migration processes, as well as allocating and tracking storage. On the bottom end of this model, you really have all of the archival processing and administration that happens inside an archive. And this is where really computational processes can help in all sorts of ways, and where our manual practices could learn a lot from the new things that we can do with technology. So computational processes, and this really speaks to that definition of computational archival science that I discussed a few minutes ago, can be used to automate aspects of description, including being able to do far more intensive description than we can afford to do manually, to maintain administrative metadata, which over the life of archived records increases in volume exponentially, to surface previously hidden aspects of collections, to identify and explain anomalies, to find gaps in collections, and then overall to curate those collections to support specific researcher or user or consumer needs. And finally, when we move to the far right-hand side, which is really our access interface, it's where what we have in the archives interacts with the consumer or the user. Archivists will need to use computational processes First, to do something again that is not shown on this model, which is actually to establish the identity of the person, the user, the consumer who is seeking to use the materials in the archive, to establish that they are who they say they are, and to establish that they have the appropriate privileges or rights to access the kinds of materials that they are requesting. So that is a sort of security interface. The second thing is that your retrieval interface would support search functions, retrieval functions, and then after the retrieval set has been delivered to the consumers submit their orders for what they actually want. They can also submit specifications of how they would like that material to be packaged. And again, you don't want that to be being done manually. You want that to be done in ways that can be automated and much more readily and quickly delivered to your consumer. The final component of that, which really is a part of delivering that content to the consumer, is ensuring that you are not delivering material that risks in any way privacy or security concerns. So you want to use computational processing to do things like automatic redaction, to mask personally identifiable information. And again, these are processes we do manually that actually can take weeks to months in many archives to do, that we would want to be able to do in a matter of seconds. And if we approached computational, we applied computational approaches judiciously, we could probably achieve that. So this is all to say that we've a long way to go. And one of the biggest problems we have is that we do not have enough teachers who are able to teach people to do this. A second problem is, who is the right person to teach? Should archivists have all of those technical skills? Should we be working with computer scientists and engineers and data scientists? And how do we know whether, we're doing a good job with that as well? So the Talent Project, which stands for the training of archival and library educators with innovative technologies, is a 2-year project that we're right in the middle of, and Professor Marciano is the lead investigator for that. It's funded by the United States Institute for Museum and Library Services. And it basically brings together 3 kinds of networks to support building educational expertise in this area. First of all, awareness of what people need to learn, then the skill set, the technical skill set. And the third part of that is the awareness of the kinds of social and ethical concerns that could arise by applying more computational and algorithmic approaches to archival work. So the 3 networks that we've brought together here in the Talent Project, one is a network of educators at a lot of different iSchools across the United States that also include people not just in archival science, but in adjacent fields as well that might have relevant expertise or need. The second is a network of historically Black colleges and universities where we have the ability to work with undergraduate students and to work on complex cases that raise some of these societal questions that are quite difficult ones for archives to grapple with. And the third is a learning science network, people who are qualified in curricular development and assessment to make sure that, we're actually going in the right direction. So the part that I'm leading with this is thinking about the kinds of social and ethical considerations that might be raised by using technology in archival processes in this way. And I've listed a few here. on this slide, and I know I don't want to run too much more on time here, but some of the kinds of considerations that we're looking at are risk exposure when we uncover hidden narratives in archival content, or how we might expose individuals who otherwise would prefer to remain hidden or would be vulnerable by being exposed. Computational storytelling that can create narratives, not just based on what is in the records, but is what is not in the records, or what is not explicit in the records. Various kinds of visualizations, including visualizations, again, what isn't there, and making silence meaningful. Perhaps just more directly technical is actually figuring out ways to identify where digital content has been deliberately altered or tampered with, and how we could flag that so that the public is aware of it, and how archivists themselves are aware of deep fakes and make sure that they're not archiving them by accident as if they were trustworthy. And, it's fine to archive them if you have made sure that people who use the material know that they aren't what they seem to be. And then addressing issues of bias, which is something that is a subject of major discourse in academic and technical fields at the moment. Bias can show up in so many different ways. It can show up in the content the digital content or the digitized content. It can show up in the ways that archivists have represented that material or the metadata that accompanies it. And these materials and metadata are used to train algorithms. So if there is bias, that bias can become increasingly skewed over time. And finally, figuring out how we then take our algorithms or algorithms that we ingest and explore and ensure that we can account for the kinds of biases that they have, and we can track that kind of skew and maybe find ways to bring them back to where they were supposed to be. So I think this is my last slide before I turn over to Professor Marciano. We're working with a framework that we have called our computational thinking framework. It has 4 different facets to it, each of which has got sets of activities associated with them. You can see them on the right-hand side here: data practices, modeling and simulation practices, computational problem-solving practices, and systems thinking practices. These are the things that we want archivists and other people who will be involved in developing computational processes for archives. We want them to understand them and understand what they can do. The extent to which any individual archivist may actually have to do it themselves will very much depend on the context that they're working in and the technical resources available to them. But on top of the technical skills, what they also need to understand, and this is the part of this project that I'm particularly working on with folks here at UCLA, is to understand the ethical and social implications of each of these kinds of practices, and to be able to demonstrate them, teach students how to look for them in real life. And so we are using a series of case studies first to teach these skills, overlaying those with a sort of analysis of what the social and the ethical issues are that even these case studies raise, and then discussing how archivists themselves can be alert to those issues when they move out into their own practice and encounter digital materials that they're going to have to work with. So I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to turn it over here to my colleague, Richard Marciano.
Well, thank you, Professor Gilliland. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. It's a pleasure to join you at this international conference. So good morning, everyone. And I'm going to build on Anne Gilliland's foundation and walk you through a few examples to try to make this a little more concrete. I think at the heart of what Professor Gilliland and I and our extended networks are trying to do is really to modernize how we teach archival science. And we're really focused on figuring out how to prepare students for what's undoubtedly going to be a digital future, increasingly digital and computational as well. So that's the motivation for this project. So I'm going to give you a few examples of CAS. I think at the heart of it, our approach has two parts. One, which Professor Gilliland just described, is to use a computational thinking framework and to map computational thinking practices into archival science processing steps. I'll try to show you a few examples of that. The second aspect of our approach is to try to borrow elements from data science techniques and bring them over to archival science and figure out which are meaningful and how to adapt them to a very different field and a very different audience. So on the left, I'll give you a first example. Since this conference is being hosted by the School of History and Culture, I thought it might be interesting to share some examples that involve historical records. So in the middle, you have a Certificate of Freedom from 1807. This is part of a collaboration with the Maryland State Archives Legacy of Slavery project. What these certificates of freedom represent, they're legal documents showing proof of freedom in a county court for African Americans who were born free. So this particular document is almost like a passport, something you needed to move openly and freely in the 1800s. The individual, one of the individuals who's referenced in this document is Smith Price. Turns out he's that's his picture, portrait on the right. Turns out he's a very prominent person. And without going into additional details, this picture was actually recreated through forensic evidence. In other words, his bones, his skull, were used as archival material, if you will, archival records, as difficult as that sounds, to give him, to represent him in the present. This just happened in 2019. So it's a very interesting document. So what you see around this document would be the outcome of applying computational archival science processes. So students who worked on this looked at this collection at scale with over 26,000 such certificates of freedom and developed tools and conducted analyses. So what you see, the kinds of analyses represented here are timelines, maps, networks, visualizations, representations of archival components, linking them, connecting them, giving them meaning. So this would be an example of a computational archival science project. If you go back to the right, you will see the computational thinking practices, the table that Professor Gilliland described. In this particular instance, only 2 of the 4 verticals were used, and not all of the 22 computational thinking practices were relevant. So let's go to the next slide. So that study was done in 2019 as part of a 2-day datathon, or we should have called it archivathon, at the Maryland State Archives with teams of students. If you want more information on this, in the interest of time, there's a paper and there's a reference here. I think you'll have a copy of these slides. Feel free to email Anne or I if we can provide more context. There's also a video of a student presenting the paper. And then what you also have is a third product, which is a computational notebook, something called Jupyter Notebook. So Notebook is one of the building blocks, pieces of infrastructure we're using in our talent project. It's like a web page or a blog, but it's much more than that. It packages the story, the computational story, tells the computational story, but packages the story with the archival records that have been datafied, so archival data sets, if you will, and code as well. So it makes the entire computational story reusable and transparent. That's what these notebooks represent, and that's what we're exploring. So next slide. So a little more on Jupyter Notebooks. There's a reference on the right, for those of you who are interested in that, which is fantastic, which is an entire book on how to use these kinds of notebooks for teaching and learning in the classroom environment, with lots of interesting examples. So increasingly, these notebooks are used by educators for teaching, for classroom exercise, for labs, for creating computational stories. So one of the products of our talent project is this portal, cases.umd.edu. That's what it looks like. And we're starting to publish these computational stories that capture these kinds of examples. Next slide, please. So since there's interest in history in this conference, I just wanted to take a step back. As a matter of fact, these are not new. There's a historical precedent for these notebooks. And I thought I would show you these because they're quite beautiful and they're interesting as well. These are historical notebooks. They're actually very famous notebooks. They're from the Cook Voyages, from Thomas Edison, from Einstein's Zurich notebook, from the voyages of Lewis and Clark. And the one on the right is very significant. It's Galileo's 1610 manuscript with observations of Jupiter and 4 of its moons. And so what these notebooks were historically were paper-based books used by scientists and explorers to capture observations, temperatures, descriptions of the landscape, notes, formulas, data. And the modern equivalent is electronic notebooks. And just for the fun of it, I put the picture from Harry Potter, where you have a newspaper that is actually interactive and live with embedded videos, etc. So let's go to the next slide. Very quickly, this is a synopsis of what these notebooks, how they're structured. This is for a particular case study, which actually focused on automatically detecting sensitive information in archival records. So it was personally identifiable information, and building an algorithmic workflow to automatically triage incident cards from World War II Japanese American camps. We looked at some 25,000 cards and triage them based on whether they can be shared with the public or whether they potentially contain sensitive material and need to be put aside or further explored. So all of our notebooks have this sort of structure, which archival practices are illustrated in the story, in the notebook. Which of these 4 themes in computational thinking and 22 practices were actually relevant? And then what we'd also like to do with the help of Professor Gilliland is tag these notebooks with particular ethical community values considerations. We don't quite have a vocabulary yet to do that. Next slide. So I'm going to show you 2 examples, and then I'll probably wrap up. This was one from the fall of 2019, there's a paper that describes everything we did. So I have a reference here if you're interested in that. And this was working with students to explore experiential, interdisciplinary, team-based learning, where we mixed archival students with engineering and computer science students and formed teams and had them work together. Next slide. So what you see here are 5 teams. There are some 20 students looking at World War II Japanese American records. This is from the National Archives. These are police reports inside internment camps that were set up after Pearl Harbor to warehouse and imprison Japanese American citizens. So there are 5 teams, one working on name registries, another on vital records, a third one on metadata control vocabularies, and then 2 teams at the bottom looking at maps and networks and visualization. What you see is that each of these teams is using this computational thinking framework as a common vocabulary. So each of the teams selected different places in the computational thinking taxonomy that represented the archival work that we're doing. And then we were able to bring all this together and have a common computational vocabulary and framework. Next, please. So this was a semester-long project, and then there was a public event with about 100 people and a movie filmmaker who came. It was very, I think, rewarding for students. Next slide. And then last example, this is something I did a few months ago this spring. So this is a graduate course in the Master of Library Information Science program called Implementing Digital Curation. And I have a link to a paper that I wrote with the students after the class was over to analyze what we did and record student feedback to get their impressions and their critique. So we use a single collection at the beginning of the semester, and the entire semester, all 15 weeks. It's modules that teach them discrete skills in computational archival science, from digitization to data wrangling, cleaning, text processing, data visualization, mapping, network thinking, etc. Next slide. And this is a summary, it's in the paper, of how we, so there were 10 students, each worked on a final project. Each of them referenced the computational thinking taxonomy, so we can reference where their digital work fits within this common framework. Each student, even though they're not programmers, this was their first exposure to this kind of technology, but each of the projects use Jupyter notebooks. And you have an example on the right column of the kinds of analyses and visualizations inside the notebook. So if you follow the link at the top, I have a recording of every single presentation and each individual notebook that you could run, look at, and build on yourself. Next slide. So I'm going to end here, and I think we're almost out of time, to talk about some of the work we're doing with colleagues and Professor Gilliland. In addition to these kinds of case studies, we're looking very closely at showcasing the use of artificial intelligence, machine learning, generative AI, large language models, all those things that are in the news these days. So I have a few examples here. I should probably show something a little more visual, but there are references that describe these case studies. So here you have a sample, we're doing more work, but a sample of 6 studies. The first 2 are on the Maryland State Archives Legacy of Slavery project. The next 2 are on the FDR Presidential Library Morgenthau Holocaust Collections project. And then we have a 5th one and the Spelman College Archives photograph collection. And finally, a last one, is one of our earlier ones on National Archives War Relocation Authority, Japanese American records, which I've mentioned before. So very quickly, I'll just point out a few things. For example, the top one, I have a paper that's coming out shortly, and if you are interested in that. We're looking at ChatGPT to build a conversational interface to historical records. So it's doing kind of data science, but talking to the collection, which is records from the 1820s and 1830s. The results were quite stunning. I mean, there's a lot more work to do. There are all kinds of ethical issues working in these environments. But you can contextualize these large language models and constrain them to the specific context of a historical collection and archival materials to try to get much more focused responses. So there's a study, and we have a couple more pieces on this. The second one was transfer learning using a family of large language models called BERT, goes back to 2018. This was to take the output of OCR, which is often noisy, and improve it by using predictive language models. So we have large language models that guess what words are missing or misspelled in the OCR. So this is an example of enhancing traditional archival processes with large language models. The third one is something Professor Gilliland alluded to. It's clear that you cannot just take archival records and feed them to large language models, generative AI. There's a whole sort of, I think, art, it should be a science, but at this point, art of figuring out how to transpose, prepare. So we have initial paper on using digital curation to transform archival collections to make them AI ready. So that's one of the studies we had. The fourth and fifth one look at improving access to the public and researchers towards creating better finding aids. So we actually use computer vision and detect patterns in documents. We don't even look at the OCR. And by looking at the shape and the layout of documents, we infer content and meaning. So we have a couple of studies that use machine learning and computer vision, and we train the algorithm to recognize the patterns and the shapes we're looking at. And then last but not least, I'll take the fifth one, and I think I'm out of time, I apologize. This is a project with a doctoral student who just actually presented her work a few days ago at a conference. There was a video, if any of you are interested in that. This was looking at not textual information, but photograph information. So this work applies computer vision with NLP and does entity extraction, so it creates metadata and looks at linking metadata to get a better signal on who is in the photo. So it links people, places, and events represented in historical photographs in order to create a more complete archival context that often has been erased or is missing in the individual photos. So I'm going to stop here with one more slide, and maybe I will pass it back to you, Professor Gilliland, if you have any concluding thoughts.
No, I just want to say thank you for such an interesting exposition of the case studies. And I know people in the audience will have access to these slides, and it is worth going in and reading in more depth particularly from that last slide that you showed. So.
Thank you for the great speech, Professor Gilliland and Professor Marciano. Enhancing the professional competence of archivists in the digital age is an important task in promoting the digital transformation of archival work. Professor Gilliland and Professor Marciano's presentation have shared with us what is computational archival science, impact of computational processes on archival work, the talent network which training students in thinking ethically, and algorithmic and examples of case studies. They brought us very special insights in the cultivation of computational thinking and the path of technological innovation, which has important implications for archival educators and practitioners today. And also, I should say thanks for you joining us very late at night and giving us such a wonderful presentation. Thanks again.
Thank you, Professor Wang.
Thank you so much.